southeastern provinces bordering the Tartar lands and defending against incursions by the Tartars, who were long a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to Poland. The Cossacks, by virtue of this service, enjoyed special privileges, including exemption from taxes and obligations, while the remainder of the Ukrainian populace endured lives of hardship and enslavement, serving the nobility and the ruling classes. It was within this landscape of privilege, oppression, and simmering resentment that the catastrophe foretold in the Psalms would unfold. The lives of the Ukrainian peasants were filled with misery and hardship. They toiled endlessly in mortar and bricks, in the labor of fields and households, serving the nobles who held dominion over them. Heavy taxes were levied upon them, and many of the landowners resorted to cruelty, even torture, to force them to embrace the Catholic faith. So degraded and impoverished had they become that even the lowliest among them were forced to accept the authority of others, becoming, in effect, servants of their own neighbors. In the year 5362 of the era of creation, according to the minor reckoning, during the 17th year of the reign of King Sigismund, a Ukrainian priest named Nalivaiko rose up to avenge the cruel treatment of his people. He addressed his followers with burning words, "How long will ye keep silent at the cruelties perpetrated by the Polish people?" With these words, he gathered an army of Ukrainians as numerous as the sand upon the shore of the sea. This army rose in rebellion against the Kingdom of Poland and conquered all of Little Russia, advancing as far as the city of Kudnow. When King Sigismund was informed of this uprising, he dispatched 2 generals fully equipped with chariots, cavalry, and soldiers to wage war against Nalivaiko. The Polish army succeeded, capturing Nalivaiko alive. He was brought to the capital city of Warsaw to stand trial for the crime of rebellion. Justice was harshly administered. Nalivaiko paid with his life, and his people were subjected to further oppression. The Cossacks who had supported him were punished, their numbers reduced from 30,000 to 20,000, while the remaining population was compelled to pay taxes to the king and the nobles. Only then did the land find a measure of rest. Years passed, and in the year 391, according to the minor reckoning, King Sigismund died after ruling Poland for 46 years. He was succeeded by his son Ladislaw, who would reign for 16 years. Ladislaw married a woman of noble descent, the daughter of Kaiser Matthias and sister of Kaiser Ferdinand, who now sat upon the throne in the city of Vienna. She died in the year 405, according to the minor reckoning, and in the following year he married another woman, daughter of the King of France and sister to the reigning French monarch. King Ladislaw was known as a just and benevolent ruler who valued Israel and upheld peace in his days. Yet rebellion continued. In the 7th year of King Ladislaw's reign, the year 5339, a Cossack named Polyuk rose to avenge the wrongs inflicted upon his people. Gathering many followers, he and his band moved to the wilderness beyond the Black Sea, a region called Behind the Threshold, or Pierogi in Russian, where the vastness of the land allowed them to assemble safely. Cossacks and Ukrainians flocked to him in hundreds and thousands, and there, in the shadow of the wilderness, they plotted to overthrow the Kingdom of Poland and extinguish the people of Israel, demanding that Jews renounce their God or be killed. Polyuk even audaciously declared himself King of Warsaw, intending to divide the kingdom among his followers. But the Holy One, blessed be he, who knows the thoughts of every heart, frustrated their designs. When they returned from the wilderness, driven by their anger and desire for vengeance, they destroyed many synagogues and killed approximately 200 Jews, while also destroying churches and slaying priests in the towns of Lahaus and Lubin. The survivors fled deeper into Poland, seeking refuge. King Ladislaw responded by dispatching 2 generals, Koniecpolski and Potocki, accompanied by a renowned warrior named Lashch with 600 troops. Lashch was to attack from the forests and encircle the rebels, while the 2 generals attacked from the opposite side. The strategy succeeded. Polyuk and his officers were captured alive, brought in chains before the king, and subjected to gruesome punishment. Polyuk was seated upon an iron chair, crowned with an iron crown heated to a fiery glow, and forced to fan the burning coals beneath him until he perished. Other officers and counselors received their just punishment. The number of privileged Cossacks was reduced from 2,000 to 6,000, while the rest were forced to pay taxes like the general Ukrainian populace, and captains of the Polish army were stationed over them to prevent further rebellion. Yet, as the chronicle reminds, there is no counsel and no understanding against the Lord. It was in this atmosphere of oppression, rebellion, and punishment that the most infamous oppressor arose. In the year 408, according to the minor reckoning, the 16th year of King Ladislaus' reign, there lived a Cossack in the town of Cheherin. His name in Russian was Shmuel, while the Poles called him Khmelnytsky. He was an officer among the hundreds of Cossacks, a man of considerable wealth, with vast herds of sheep and oxen, possessing more cattle than most men could count. He was cunning and evil, a master of war, and a man of sinister designs. His residence in Cheherin was under the jurisdiction of General Koniecpolski, yet his ambition and malice extended far beyond his town. Khmelnytsky would go on to bring suffering to the lands of Little Russia, Lithuania, and Poland, years of terror and destruction whose memory would endure in the hearts of the people forever. The general, a man of experience and careful judgment, knew well the man who would later bring terror across the lands. Khmelnytsky, or Khmelnytsky as the Poles called him, was soft-spoken in appearance, courteous in speech, yet in his heart he bore 7 abominations. He was a schemer, a man who plotted iniquity and evil, cunning like many Ukrainians of his time, who at first appeared friendly to the Jews. They spoke sweet and comforting words, beguiling their neighbors with soft speech, yet their tongues were deceitful and untrustworthy. The general often warned his officers and counselors, saying, "I am fearful that out of this man will come misfortune to the kingdom of Poland." Time and again he searched for a pretext to remove Khmelnytsky from the world, yet found none, for Khmelnytsky was ever cautious, aware of dangers, sly in warfare, careful not to arouse suspicion. As the general's life drew to a close, he imparted his wisdom to his son, who held the position of Kharanzi, the banner-bearer of the king in times of war. The general warned him, "You know this man Shmuel and his evil designs. Therefore, you must devise some pretext so that you will be able to remove him from the world." Years passed, and the young Kharanzi, after the death of his father, married a woman of noble descent, the sister of the nobleman Khmelnytsky. As was customary in the Kingdom of Poland, marriages of noble families required vast expenditure. A man of only 1,000 gold pieces would borrow and mortgage to spend 2,000 gold pieces in honor of his bride. After the wedding, he journeyed beyond the Dnieper River, the great river of the land where the Cossacks lived, to display his wealth and receive gifts in celebration. There he intended to rally the Cossacks for a sudden attack upon the Tartars, seeking to seize riches and spoils, as had been the custom for generations. Upon arriving in the town of Cheherin, they were warmly received. The city's governor and administrator was a Jew named Zechariah Sobolenki. Like many Jews in Little Russia, Zechariah held the office of tax farmer, responsible for collecting levies and managing the city's revenues. This position of authority over the populace made the Jewish administrators objects of jealousy and resentment among the peasants, and it was often cited as one cause of the massacres. The nobleman, seeking to identify the wealthy, asked Zechariah for a list of the richest citizens. Zechariah included the oppressor Khmelnytsky among them, noting his vast flocks of sheep and oxen. The nobleman, recalling his father's warning about this treacherous man, thought, "Surely this wealth has been seized from my serfs. It is mine to take." He therefore appropriated a shed containing hundreds of Khmelnytsky's cattle, amounting to nearly half of his stock. Shmuel, silent at first, feigned submission, lest he provoke the nobleman, for the man was regarded as a king in his own province. Yet Shmuel was not one to forget or forgive. Seeking revenge, he sent a written warning to the Tartars, "Be on guard, for the nobleman, the Kharanzi, and his troops intend to attack you." The Tartars, previously living in peace, armed themselves with swords and bows and prepared to meet the approaching force. Realizing that his plan had been revealed, the nobleman, vastly outnumbered, was forced to retreat in shame to his lands. The source of his misfortune remained unknown to him at the time. Once, while drinking with friends at the inn of Zechariah, Khmelnytsky boasted of his revenge. "I have taken vengeance upon the nobleman who expropriated my flocks. He recounted the entire story, not realizing that another Jew, Jacob Sobolensky, a close friend, sat nearby listening. Jacob immediately informed the nobleman, who promptly had Shmuel seized and placed in iron chains, imprisoned and awaiting death. Shmuel's cunning, however, was not so easily subdued. Jacob Sobolensky counseled him to have his friends post bail and to appear before the nobleman on bended knees, pleading for his life and claiming that the Jewish governor had spoken falsely out of enmity. Shmuel followed this advice, and by the testimony of friends, he was released. Yet when the nobleman, after careful investigation, confirmed the truth of the governor's statements, Shmuel was imprisoned a second time. The nobleman and his wife then departed for their principal city of Brody in Little Poland. There he instructed the local officer of the Thousand to execute Shmuel and deliver his head to him under threat of his own life should the task fail. Shmuel, ever shrewd, spoke to his fellow officers in prison. "Why are you silent? Know that the people of Poland grow more haughty each day. They enslave our people with hard labor. Today it is done to me. Tomorrow it will be done to you. Soon they will plow the fields with our people as one plows with oxen." Thus the seeds of vengeance were sown, and the shadow of Khmel's malice stretched long over the lands, a cunning and dangerous adversary who would shape history through deceit, cruelty, and ambition. Shmuel, cunning and relentless, spoke quietly to his followers, whispering his plan with a voice that carried both promise and threat. "If you heed my counsel, you will approach the officer of the Thousand and plead with him to release me into your custody on the occasion of the festival of baptism, which is to be held tomorrow. At night, you and I will escape together, carrying all our belongings by way of the ferry boats behind the great Dnieper River. There, in the wilderness, we will gather and take counsel as to how to act against the people of Poland." And so it came to pass. All the officers of the hundreds, those leaders of the smaller military units among the Cossacks, went to the officer of the Thousand, pleading for Khmel's release on their guarantee. That night, they all fled behind the Dnieper River, disappearing into the vast and shadowed wilderness. From this hidden refuge, Shmuel dispatched letters to settlements where Ukrainians dwelt, calling them to join his cause. His message was answered with zeal. Some 20,000 unruly men, hungry for revenge and plunder, rallied to his banner. When word reached the King of Poland and his nobles, they laughed, dismissing the rebellion as a mere nuisance. "They will fall into our hands again," they said, recalling the failures of prior uprisings, yet the danger was far more serious than they imagined. Two Polish generals, Potocki and Kalinowski, accompanied by 1,000 trained troops, marched to the city of Korsun, strategically positioning themselves to guard the river crossings and prevent Shmuel and his men from advancing. But the rebellion had already begun, even before the joyous festival of Purim in the year 1648, according to the Christian calendar. Behind the Dnieper Falls, Shmuel gathered his troops and addressed them with careful words, for he knew the might of their enemies. "You know well that the Poles are stronger than we," he warned. "They possess the strength of lions and leopards, their faces aflame with fury. Who among us has ever triumphed over them? Therefore hear my counsel. Let us make peace with the Tartars, and together we will wage war upon them." His followers, hardened men accustomed to the harshness of the steppe, answered with resolve, "We will do as you say." Shmuel, master of strategy and diplomacy, journeyed to the king of the Tartars, accompanied by his troops. There he forged a pact. The Tartars and the Ukrainians would unite their forces to strike at the kingdom of Poland. They agreed on the division of the spoils of war, men and livestock for the Tartars, gold, silver, and clothing for the Cossacks. It was a calculated alliance, reminiscent of the ancient peace between the tribes of Midian and Moab, who had joined forces out of hatred for Israel. The Allied forces moved through the desert and the forests, silent and vigilant, until they neared the Polish encampment. One day before their arrival, scouts crept into the Polish camp, observing the enemy. They saw soldiers few in number, encamped upon a hill, feasting and drinking with drums and dancing. "The enemy is unaware of us," the scouts reported. "We are strong enough to overcome them. Let us strike." Shmuel commanded his men to dig pits and ditches on the hill and throughout the valley, preparing traps that would leave the Poles with no escape. On Tuesday, the fourth day of the month of Sivan, in the year 1648, the Tartars and the Ukrainians launched their attack. The Tartars came from one side, the Ukrainians from the other. The Polish soldiers, realizing the trap, attempted to flee, but the ditches and pits held them fast. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Poles fell into despair. They pleaded for mercy, and the Tartars, showing some measure of restraint, took the entire Polish army captive, binding the two generals, Potocki and Kalinowski, in iron chains. They endured torture, and their fates were sealed by Schmiel's cunning and the might of his united forces. Word of Schmiel's success spread like wildfire. Polish magnates, once loyal to the king, now saw the winds of fortune shifting, and, seduced by the promise of power, joined Schmiel. Even the captain once assigned to behead him pledged loyalty, becoming a commander in Schmiel's army. The personal secretary and scribe of the deceased General Konieczpolski, a man of great intelligence and knowledge of the Kingdom of Poland's military strategy, became Khmel's advisor. Thus, the enemies of the Kingdom of Poland now swelled Schmiel's ranks, turning former allies of the king into foes. On that same day, news arrived that King Władysław, ruler of the Kingdom of Poland, had died. The entire kingdom fell into chaos, leaderless and vulnerable. The nobles despaired, fleeing their estates and cities, leaving the common people defenseless. Among the terror-stricken were the Jews, whose hearts melted with fear, for they knew the vengeance that Schmiel and his forces could unleash. Yet even in this darkness, a beacon of hope remained. Duke Michael Wisniewicki, renowned for his valor and remembered as a friend of Israel, commanded his army beyond the Dnieper River. With him fled 500 Jewish men, each with his wife and children. The Duke led them with the precision and care of an eagle carrying its young, instructing those in danger to follow his lead and guiding them past the lurking threats. On the first day of the festival of Shavuot, when the Jewish people were meant to rejoice and give thanks, all of them took flight, abandoning gold, silver, and worldly possessions. They fled for their lives across the province of Ostrog and its surrounding towns, Biala Tserkiv, Pawoloch, Kudnow, and Lubartau, seeking refuge in fortified cities such as Polano, Zaslaw, Ostrog, the capital, and Stary Konstantino. The communities around Nemiro fled to the city of Nemiro, those near Tulchin fled to Tulchin, and those around Bar, including Winis, Starograd, and Krasny, sought shelter within the city walls of Bar. Those who failed to escape or were caught were slain without mercy, victims of a wrath that spared no one. Beyond the great Dnieper River, in communities perched near the battlefield, terror descended like a dark cloud. In towns such as Pereyaslaw, Barishoka, Piratin, Borispol, Lubin, and Lachautes, along with their neighboring villages, countless innocent lives were brutally extinguished for the sanctification of the holy name. The methods of slaughter were unimaginable in their cruelty. Some were skinned alive, their flesh cast to ravenous dogs. Others had their hands and limbs hacked from their bodies, which were then left upon the roads to be crushed under the wheels of carts and the hooves of horses. Many were left to writhe in their own blood, wounded and helpless, until death claimed them slowly. Some were even buried alive. Infants, held in the laps of their mothers, were murdered in sight of their families, sliced into pieces like fish. Pregnant women suffered beyond comprehension. Their bellies were cut open, their infants torn from them and thrown before their eyes, or live cats were placed inside and their abdomens sewn up while the creatures struggled within. Hands were severed to prevent removing the cats, while infants were impaled on spears, roasted over fire, and presented to their mothers as instruments of torment. The enemies used the bodies of children as makeshift bridges to cross rivers and streets. There was no cruelty known in the world that was not inflicted during these days. Every form of capital punishment, stoning, burning, beheading, and strangling, was unleashed upon the Jewish people. Many were carried into captivity by the Tartars, who seized women and virgins, committing acts of desecration before the eyes of their husbands. Some were forced into servitude as handmaids, others as concubines or wives. Similar atrocities were visited upon the Polish people, particularly the priests and bishops, as the rebellion swept across the lands. West of the Dnieper, several thousand Jewish souls perished, and hundreds were coerced into abandoning their faith. Sacred scrolls of the Torah were torn apart and turned into boots and shoes. The leather boxes of the phylacteries were discarded into the streets, while other holy books were used to pave roads, kindle fires, or fill gun barrels. The noise of these horrors and the cries of the victims echoed like a storm across the land. When the Jewish communities of Pogrebishche, Ziłotów, Baziovka, and Techio and the surrounding villages learned of the devastation beyond the Dnieper, they faced a grim choice. The Tartars had encircled the cities on one side and the Ukrainians on the other. If we wait for the Ukrainians to attack, they said, we shall either be slain or forced into baptism, God forbid. Better to surrender to the Tartars, for our brethren in Constantinople and other Turkish lands are merciful and will ransom us. And so they did. The four communities yielded to the Tartars, surrendering men, women, and children, around 3,000 souls. Among them was a cantor, Reb Hirsch of Ziłotów, who upon the arrival of the Tartars chanted the memorial prayer, El Male Rachamim, beseeching the Lord full of compassion on behalf of their slaughtered brethren. The people wept bitterly, and it seemed that their cries ascended to the heavens. The hearts of the Tartars were stirred, and they comforted the captives, saying, do not despair, do not refuse food or drink. Ritual slaughterers among you shall prepare abundant sheep and oxen, and we will send you to your brethren in Constantinople to be ransomed. The Tartars kept their word. The Jewish communities in Constantinople, may the Lord protect them, redeemed the captives, along with other Polish prisoners, numbering around 20,000 souls. They spent vast sums providing shelter, food, and care, continuing even to this day. The generosity extended to them throughout the lands of Turkey, particularly from the city of Salonika and from the renowned cities of Venice, Livorno, and the holy communities of Italy, whose gold and silver flowed to Constantinople for the redemption of the captives. May the Lord bless these righteous people and protect them from evil until the coming of the Redeemer. After these events, the Tartars returned to their lands with all their spoils, while Khmel, together with his Cossack forces and many thousands of Tartars who had remained loyal, marched triumphantly to his home city of Chehivin. The streets were filled with jubilant townspeople who welcomed him with timbrels, dancing, and great rejoicing. They hailed him as Prince and Liberator, praising him for freeing them from the oppression of the Polish nobles who had burdened them with relentless labor. In the privacy of his home, Khmel summoned his servants, ministers, and advisors. Come, let us take counsel together, he said. We must not be regarded with shame or derision by our enemies. The people of Poland abhor us, and if the Catholic kings learn of our deeds, they will wage war upon us, and we are few in number. His advisors replied with caution, we offer this counsel. Send letters to the Polish nobles and dukes, words of peace and truth, expressions of regret for all that has been done, claiming necessity for self-preservation. At the same time, send messengers to the king of the Tartars to provide reinforcements. In this way, you may delay the mobilization of their troops and consolidate your power. Thus, even amid the triumph and terror, Khmel plotted, maneuvered, and prepared for the storms that still lay ahead, as the lands of Poland and Little Russia trembled beneath his relentless ambition. Khmel, may his name be blotted out, did not rest upon his triumphs. He dispatched secret letters to all the Ukrainian communities throughout the Kingdom of Poland, commanding them to prepare for the appointed time to rise together, to stand for their lives, and to take vengeance upon their enemies, the nobles and the Jewish people. He urged them to gather in secret, to destroy, to slay, and to bring to ruin all those who would oppose them, the men, the women, and the children, and to seize their wealth as spoils. The Jews, ever vigilant, learned of these plans through friendly Ukrainians who remained loyal, as well as through their own network of spies who had been placed in each settlement. Word reached the nobles immediately. Messages traveled swiftly, carried on horseback from community to community, warning both Jews and nobles of the approaching calamity. In response, the nobles banded together with the Jewish communities in unprecedented unity. Their hearts and purposes joined as if they were one soul. The Almighty, blessed be He, sends the cure before the plague. Without this forewarning, there would have been no escape for the remnant of Israel. God forbid. Wherever the oppressor's command reached, the Ukrainians rejoiced with dark satisfaction, while the nobles and Jews mourned deeply, Fasting, weeping, bitter cries, prayers, and acts of charity filled the days, yet the hand of the oppressor remained extended, and the wrath of the Lord was not yet stilled. Shmuel sent letters of peace to the dukes and nobles, filled with words of comfort and sympathy. He claimed that all his actions had been necessary to save those doomed to death, invoking the principle that the persecuted are not accountable for their deeds. He promised to return estates and urged the nobles to return home, but they trusted him not. They understood the deceit, sensing that his offers of peace masked a hidden danger, a dark peace meant to ensnare them. They remembered his actions beyond the Dnieper, where he had destroyed churches, slain priests, and seized estates. In their fear, they wrote to the Archbishop of Gniezno, known in Italian as the Cardinal, whose seat was in the city of Gniezno. This cardinal, Casimir, may his glory increase, was regent of the kingdom during the king's death to prevent Poland from being left without a leader. The cardinal appointed Duke Ladislaw Dominic, may his glory increase, Archduke of Zaslaw, as commander, though he was inexperienced in warfare. He was chosen not for valor, but for wealth, for the cardinal believed that fortune would outweigh skill. Thus, in the words of the sages, when the shepherd is wroth with the sheep, he blinds their leader. All nobles were commanded to assemble and avenge themselves upon their enemies. Yet, as was customary in the Kingdom of Poland, they gathered slowly, lacking dispatch. This was a fatal contrast to the Tartars and the Ukrainians, who moved swiftly with purpose and precision. Shmuel, may his name be blotted out, learned that many Jews had gathered in the holy community of Nemiro, a city renowned for its wealth and righteousness. Nemiro was a place of learning and justice, a city filled with scholars and scribes, a sanctuary of holiness now threatened by his malice. He dispatched a commander, an enemy of the Jews, with 600 swordsmen, and called upon the city leaders to aid the attack. The local officials responded eagerly, driven less by love for Khmelnytsky than by hatred for the Jews. On Wednesday, the 20th day of the month of Sivan, the Cossacks approached Nemiro. From afar, the Jewish residents beheld the troops, and their hearts trembled with fear. They could not yet discern whether the approaching force was Polish or Cossack. With wives, children, and all their silver and gold, they fled into the fortress, locking and barring the doors, ready to defend themselves. But Shmuel, ever cunning, devised a scheme. His troops bore flags identical to those of the Polish army, for the people could distinguish Polish from Cossack forces only by the banners they displayed. The citizens of the city called to the Jews in the fortress, declaring, "Open the gate. This is a Polish army, come to protect you from your enemies, should they arrive." Believing the words and seeing the familiar flags, the Jews, standing vigil on the walls, opened the gates, unaware that treachery had come disguised as salvation. No sooner had the gates of the fortress been opened than the Cossacks surged in, swords drawn, and the townspeople, armed with swords, spears, scythes, and in some cases only with clubs, joined them in the slaughter. The Jewish men, women, and children were mercilessly attacked. Young girls and women were seized and defiled, yet some, in their courage and faith, leapt into the moat surrounding the fortress to escape defilement by the uncircumcised, choosing death over dishonor. Many who tried to swim to safety were pursued, struck down by the swords and scythes of the Ukrainians. Others were pierced by bullets, and the waters of the moat ran red with the blood of the slaughtered. Among those present was the esteemed head of the Rabbinical Academy of Nemiro, the Rabbi, His Excellency, our master and teacher, Rabbi Jekiel Michael, son of His Excellency, Rabbi Eliezer, of blessed memory. He was a man learned in all rabbinic writings and proficient in worldly sciences. On the Sabbath before the catastrophe, he had preached to the people, urging them that should the enemy come, they must not forsake their faith, but rather accept martyrdom for the sanctification of the name of the Lord. Following his own counsel, he attempted to escape by swimming, but a Ukrainian seized him. The rabbi pleaded for his life, promising a great sum of gold and silver, and the Ukrainian, swayed by the offer, led him to a house where his treasure was hidden and released him. That night, the rabbi and his mother remained in hiding until morning. On the 22nd day of the month of Sivan, the Ukrainians searched the town for hidden Jews. The rabbi and his mother fled to the cemetery, hoping that if they were killed, they would at least receive a proper burial. But a Ukrainian shoemaker, one of the townspeople, pursued them, club in hand, inflicting grievous wounds. The rabbi's mother pleaded for her son, yet the man paid no heed and struck down the rabbi first and then his mother. May the Lord avenge their blood. 3 days later, the rabbi's wife buried him, while many women in the town had been spared, except for the old and feeble. In a separate act of faith and courage, a beautiful maiden from a wealthy family was captured by a Cossack who forced her to be his wife. She claimed to possess magical protection, daring him to shoot her. When he fired, she fell and died, choosing sanctification of the name of the Lord over dishonor. Another young woman, about to be married to a Cossack, requested that the ceremony take place in a church across the bridge. As soon as they arrived, she leapt into the river, drowning herself to preserve her faith. Such acts of martyrdom were numerous, too many to recount in full. The massacre in Nemero claimed approximately 6,000 souls, men, women, and children, all dying by cruel and violent means. Those who survived fled to the fortified city of Tolchen. After the calamity in Nemero, a band of 10,000 unruly men, hooligans, and scoundrels gathered under the leadership of Krivonos. May his name be blotted out, and advanced on the holy community of Tolchen. There, 600 Polish troops and 2,000 Jews had assembled, including trained soldiers and seasoned warriors. The Jews and nobles made a covenant to protect one another and took oaths not to betray each other. They reinforced the fortress and took positions on the ramparts, prepared to defend themselves with all manner of weapons. Each time the Cossacks drew near, the defenders shot arrows and bullets, inflicting heavy losses. The attackers fled, only to regroup with villagers and neighboring communities, their numbers swelling into the tens of thousands. They brought iron battering rams to breach the walls, shouting with the wild cries and ferocity for which the Cossacks were notorious. The defenders' hearts trembled at the sight of such a multitude, yet they continued to fight, shooting from the walls and keeping the enemy at bay. After several days of siege, the Ukrainians sent envoys to propose peace, demanding that the Jewish valuables be surrendered as ransom for their lives. The nobles in the fortress agreed to this deceitful offer and called upon the Jews to disarm themselves one by one until they were defenseless. The Jews, recognizing the treachery, contemplated rising against the nobles first, for they had broken their covenant. Yet Rabbi Aaron, the president of the Rabbinical Academy of Tolchen, our teacher and master, called out to the people, "Hearken, my brethren, we are exiled among the nations. Should you strike the nobles and the Catholic kings hear of it, vengeance will descend upon our brethren in foreign lands, God forbid. If our fate is decreed from heaven, let us accept it with rejoicing. We are not worthier than our brethren of Nemero. May the Almighty show mercy upon us, and perhaps they will accept our possessions as ransom for our lives." The Jews hearkened to his counsel, bringing all their salvaged valuables into the courtyard of the fortress. No sooner had the Ukrainians entered the fortress than the leader of the Polish nobles, Duke Kwierczynski, spoke to them, his voice trembling with both fear and forced obedience. "Behold, here is the prize which you requested." At once, the Ukrainians claimed all the treasures, gold, silver, and precious belongings of the Jewish community. Then they commanded the Duke to imprison the Jews, leaving their lives in uncertainty, uncertain whether the oppressors would keep their word. For 3 agonizing days, the Jews endured torment and fear, until the Ukrainians returned to the nobles, demanding that all the Jews be delivered into their hands. Broken-hearted and weary, the Jews were forced out of the fortress so that the nobles might escape harm. They were assembled in an enclosed garden, guarded tightly, unable to flee, and left there for an extended period of time. Among those trapped were 3 great scholars of the Jewish faith, men of profound wisdom and learning. His Excellency, our teacher and master, Rabbi Eliezer, His Excellency, our teacher and master, Rabbi Solomon, and His Excellency, our teacher and master, Rabbi Chaim. They exhorted the people to sanctify the name of the Lord and to remain faithful, refusing to abandon their religion. With one voice, the assembled Jews declared, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. As there is but one in your hearts, so is there but one in our hearts." Then an intermediary of the Ukrainians appeared, planting a banner in the ground and calling loudly to the Jews, "Whoever wishes to change his faith and remain alive, let him sit under this banner." 3 times he made the call, and not one responded. In fury, the gate of the garden was thrown open, and the mob surged in, wielding swords, spears, and clubs. Approximately 1,500 Jewish souls perished in that garden, meeting every imaginable form of cruel and violent death. The 3 revered scholars, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Solomon, and Rabbi Chaim, fell by the sword. May the Lord avenge their blood. The Ukrainians then seized 10 rabbis, imprisoning them in chains and demanding 10,000 gold pieces for their ransom. Among them was the scholar, our teacher and master, Rabbi Aaron, son of the scholar, our teacher and master Rabbi Meir. May the merciful God preserve and redeem him. Rabbi Meir was the president of the Rabbinical Academy of the Holy Community of Lwów, a city of great learning and wealth. The Ukrainians knew that Rabbi Meir would pay any price to secure the life of his son. Having completed the massacre of the Jews, the Ukrainians turned their attention to the fortress itself. The nobles confronted them. "Behold, you made an agreement with us. Why do you repudiate your pledge?" The Ukrainians answered with cold cruelty. "As you did unto the Jews, breaking your promise, so shall we do unto you, measure for measure." The attackers set the fortress ablaze, smoke and flame consuming all within. Nobles were killed, countless others perished in the inferno, and the loot of gold, silver, and valuables was seized. The wife and daughters of Duke Kwierczynski were violated in the presence of their father before his death. Duke Kwierczynski himself, a man of great girth, could not rise from his chair. A former slave who had once worked in his flour mill approached him with mockery and said, "What does the master desire of his servant?" Recalling the Duke's harsh treatment of his own serfs, he taunted, "Stand up, and I will sit in your chair and be your master." The Duke was unable to rise. With a saw, the former servant cut off the Duke's head at the threshold of his house, an act of grim justice for the wrongs committed. When the nobles learned of this brutal betrayal, remorse filled their hearts, and they resolved no longer to deliver Jews into the hands of the Ukrainian marauders. Even as the Ukrainians promised them immunity, they no longer trusted these words. Had they faltered, there would have been no escape for the remaining Jews. God forbid. After 3 days of carnage, the Ukrainians announced that those who were still alive might rise, for the massacre was complete. Approximately 300 individuals, having hidden among the corpses, emerged, starving, wounded, barefoot, and naked. They had survived by sheer will, and with the faint breath of life, they made their way to the city, where the Ukrainian inhabitants showed kindness, providing safety and sending them away unharmed. The marauders departed from Tulchin, laden with silver, gold, precious stones, diamonds, and captured women and maidens, both Jewish and Polish, including the 10 imprisoned rabbis. When the dukes and nobles heard of the atrocities committed in Nemiro and Tulchin, fear and rage consumed them. They agreed to mobilize all the Polish nobles to seek vengeance. By order of the cardinal, the general announced throughout the Kingdom of Poland, "Every officer and everyone registered among the king's troops shall enlist for war or send a servant in his place." At that time, Duke Wisniowiecki of blessed memory, with his forces stationed in Lithuania, learned of the devastation in Nemiro, a city under his rule. Grief-stricken and filled with righteous anger, he mobilized some 3,000 men to march upon Nemiro, vowing not to relent until he had bathed in the blood of the Ukrainian enemies who had wrought destruction across his lands and expelled the people from his domain. As they approached Nemiro, he dispatched several hundred troops into the city, slaying a large number of the local inhabitants. The remaining Ukrainians, cunning and deceitful, persuaded the Duke to send additional troops into the city under the pretense of defending it against Cossacks and Tartars. They promised to support him faithfully in the conflict and swore an oath to serve him. Trusting their words, the Duke dispatched many nobles and 600 of his best soldiers. The people of the city received them with honor, unaware that they were walking into another web of treachery and danger. Several days later, the inhabitants of the city secretly notified the Cossacks, "Make haste and come here at night. We will open the gates for you." Under the cover of darkness, the Cossacks entered the city, and the sleeping nobles were slain in their beds. The Cossacks, persuaded by a considerable sum of money, agreed to remain in the city to protect it from any counterattack by the Polish nobles. When Duke Wisniowiecki of blessed memory learned of this treachery, his heart trembled. He refrained from sending additional troops, realizing the danger of walking into a trap. Instead, he turned his efforts toward Machnauka, where he struck at the Cossacks with relentless force, killing many within the city and surrounding villages. When the oppressor, Chmiel, heard that Duke Wisniowiecki was advancing with a mere 3,000 men and had inflicted a severe blow upon his forces, he dispatched his general Krzywonos, may his name be blotted out, with 10,000 of his best troops to engage the Duke in battle. Chmiel instructed his general to capture the Duke alive should he prevail. Yet God protected Duke Wisniowiecki, and he emerged unscathed from the enemy's grasp. As the Duke and his forces learned that they were being surrounded on all sides by the Ukrainians, he withdrew from the city to avoid encirclement, moving toward Berdychow. There resided Tyszkiewicz, the voyevoda, a commander with 1,000 seasoned troops. Joining forces with him, the Duke marshaled 4,000 soldiers and advanced close to the borders of Poland. They had written to General Duke Władysław Dominik, requesting reinforcements, but the general withheld them, motivated by envy. Duke Władysław Dominik had been a rival of Duke Wisniowiecki, for the people had once preferred the latter as general due to his renown and valor as a mighty warrior. Hoping for the Duke's downfall, he denied aid. The Duke and the voyevoda advanced to a point about 1 mile beyond the city of Poleno, while the Cossacks and Tartars closed in behind them. Additional troops from the Ukrainian people gathered, swelling their forces to approximately 20,000 men. Together, the Ukrainians and the Tartars besieged the city of Poleno, preparing for an assault that would bring both Polish nobles and Jews to the brink of annihilation. It came to pass on Tuesday, the first day of the month of Av, that the Tartars and Ukrainians launched their siege. They prepared to attack a city strongly fortified where the nobles and Jews had taken refuge. Among the defenders were 2,000 seasoned Polish nobles and 12,000 Jews, all trained in combat. The city was protected by a double wall and surrounded by a deep moat, providing strong defense, except on the side adjacent to 2 settlements inhabited by some Ukrainians. The nobles, in their judgment, had placed their strongest serfs on the walls to guard the most vulnerable side. Yet, the protectors became the destroyers of the city. Among the serfs were Ukrainians, known as Haiduki, mercenaries who secretly betrayed the city. On Wednesday, the second day of Av, the enemy captured the settlements inhabited by these Ukrainians, who then assisted in the attack on the fortress. They called to the serfs on the walls, "Behold, we are your brothers. Why do you fight against us? Is it not more advantageous to serve your own people than those who are not of your blood?" The serfs rebelled, pretending to defend the city, but allowing ladders to be placed against the walls, and on Thursday, the fortress fell. Thousands of Ukrainians poured into the city with drawn swords, and massacre followed. Nobles who were mounted on horses fled to safety, but the Jewish defenders, standing firm, were killed for the sanctification of the name. Approximately 10,000 souls perished in the most terrible deaths ever witnessed, their necks stretched to the slaughter. One among them was a divinely inspired Kabbalist, our teacher and master Rabbi Samson of the Holy Community of Ostropol. He was gifted with the daily appearance of an angel who revealed to him the mysteries of the Torah. Rabbi Samson had composed a commentary on the Zohar based on the teachings of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, of blessed memory. Though he preached repentance to his community to avert disaster, the evil decree had already been sealed. When the enemies invaded, Rabbi Samson and 300 of the most prominent citizens, each dressed in shrouds with prayer shawls covering their heads, entered the synagogue to pray fervently. When the attackers arrived, they killed all of them upon the sacred ground of the synagogue. Many hundreds who survived were forced to abandon their faith, and many were taken captive by the Tartars. Messengers from the city of Zaslaw, only 6 miles from Polano, reported daily to the surrounding communities about the siege. On that Tuesday, the first day of Av, the messenger could not reach the city due to the encircling enemies. On Wednesday, he returned with the dreadful news. The Tartars and Ukrainians were besieging the holy community of Polano. On Thursday, whoever could flee did so, abandoning homes filled with valuables, books, and merchandise, leaving behind all earthly possessions to save their lives. We thought only of saving ourselves, our sons, and our daughters. Some among us escaped to the capital city of Ostrog, the metropolis of Little Russia, a city renowned for its scholars and scribes, a place where learning and wealth thrived together. I, together with my family and my father-in-law, His Honor, the Master, Rabbi Abraham of the Holy Community of Zaslav, fled with our families and relatives to the Holy Community of Miedzierzeche, located 2,000 else, a measure of distance, away from Ostrog. In Ostrog and the surrounding community of Miedzierzeche lived more than 10,000 householders, each with their families. We had intended to tarry there for the Sabbath Hazon, a day of prophetic reflection and teaching, so we might learn of the situation in Polano, how matters stood with our brethren under siege. On Friday afternoon, we arrived in Miedzierzeche only to be met by a messenger with alarming news. He reported that Duke of Zaslav, General Dominic, was expected to arrive that day with a large army to assist Duke Wisniowiecki in Polano against the besieging Tartars and Ukrainians. And thus it was. The Duke, with 1,000 warriors, arrived, and soon after the great hero Lashch and the remainder of his army followed behind. Among us there was rejoicing and hope. We believed that after the Sabbath Hazon we could return to our homes only 4 miles distant from the holy community of Zaslav, and that our brethren in Polano would be liberated from their torment. But on the eve of the Sabbath, a nobleman, Wisawati, governor of Polano, arrived with dreadful tidings. He, together with many other nobles, had fled. He declared, "Polano has been captured. All the nobles and Jews therein have been murdered. The enemy's onslaught is moving swiftly towards Zaslav. Duke Wisniowiecki and his troops have fled to Konstantinov, pursued by Tartars and Ukrainians. Some of them are marching toward Ostrog and Miedzierzeche." A great fear fell upon the Jews, the heads of Edom, as it were, and no one could summon courage. Every eye was turned to General Duke Dominic. What would he do? In the dead of night, the general withdrew by the very gate through which he had arrived from Poland, avoiding the main road to Konstantinov by way of Zaslav, for a large army of Tartars and Ukrainians blocked the path. He took a circuitous route through the woods to Khmelnytsky, a distance of 9 miles, to await reinforcements before proceeding to Konstantinov. Yet the people believed that the general had fled to the kingdom of Poland. They despaired, saying, "If a flame among the cedars falls, what avails the lichen on the wall?" In other words, if the leader departs, what hope remains for us? The heads of the community of Ostrog declared that no Jew should remain in their community, nor in Miedzierzeche, for the enemy was only 2 miles away. They warned that the Ukrainians within the city could not be trusted and might harm the refugees themselves. All the people fled in accordance with this warning. Those who had horses and carts took them. Those who did not, even if they had sufficient money to buy a horse, fled on foot, taking their wives and children by hand and abandoning all belongings. Some, burdened with wagons full of merchandise, books, and valuables, unloaded them at the inns to travel more lightly. On that Sabbath Hazon, 3 rows of horses and carts moved along the road side by side, stretching for 7 miles from Ostrog to the holy community of Dubno, accompanied by innumerable pedestrians. Within 2 hours, 3 horsemen, one a Jew named Moses Hannover of Ostrog, and 2 nobles, overtook the fleeing people. They cried, "Why do you march so slowly? The enemy is close behind. They are now in Miedzierzeche. We barely escaped." Panic seized the people of Israel in indescribable measure. Every man and woman threw from their carts silver, gold, vessels, books, pillows, and bed covers to lighten their load. The fields were strewn with gold, silver, and clothing, abandoned by those who cared only to save the lives of their families. Some abandoned even their horses and carts, fleeing with only their children in hand. Many men and women, overcome by fear, released their children in the panic and ran into the woods or fell into pits. Yet, in truth, the Tartars and Ukrainians were not pursuing them. The fear was so great that every heart imagined the enemy at its heels. On the Sunday following the Sabbath Hazon, the truth became clear. General Dominic had not fled to Poland, but had only moved to Khmelnytsky. From that day, the pace of the flight slackened. Refugees wandered from town to town, sleeping in the streets, robbed, despised, and crushed by fear. The words of Scripture rang true. "And among these nations shalt thou have no repose, and there shall be no rest for the sole of thy feet, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear night and day, and shalt have no assurance of thy life. Every night spent in the inns of Ukrainian towns was marked by terror, for the innkeepers were often rebels themselves. Each dawn that we arose alive, we recited the prayer, "Blessed art thou, O Lord, who quickenest the dead." After the enemies had captured the holy community of Polano and had done with it all that they willed, their wrath turned toward the holy community of Zaslav. They descended upon this city, plundering the entire community. Those who had been unable to escape, about 200 souls, perished at their hands, sickened and weak, unable to flee. Some had placed their trust in the Ukrainians whom they believed friends, hiding in the forests, hoping to survive the fury of the marauders. There they lingered for many days, nearly perishing from hunger and thirst. They chose death by the sword rather than life by starvation, saying among themselves, "Come, let us go to the city, for we prefer to be victims of the sword than of starvation." When they entered the city, their so-called friends, the Ukrainians, seized them to be killed. The victims implored that they be executed in the cemetery so that their bodies might be buried. Their request was granted, and they were led to the cemetery. There, they entered the chapel upon the cemetery grounds and were slain within its sacred walls. Afterwards, the houses were set ablaze. The Jews were condemned to 2 forms of death, beheading and burning. The Catholic priests of the city of Zaslav were skinned alive. The graves of dukes long interred were violated. Their remains were torn from the earth and tossed aside, like carcasses trampled underfoot. Gold and silver mausoleums were desecrated. Catholic monasteries, as well as synagogues, were destroyed, converted into stables for horses. The same horrors were repeated in the holy community of Ostrog, the capital, where 600 souls who had remained were mercilessly slaughtered. From there, the enemies, with all their troops, turned their fury toward the holy community of Konstantinov. Duke Wisniowiecki went forth to meet them and inflicted upon them a severe loss, but he returned to Constantinople with his forces. Fearing that the Ukrainian inhabitants within the city might rebel against him, since many among the attackers outside were also Ukrainians, he withdrew. With him departed all the glory and hope of the city. Duke Wisniowiecki, his troops, and the Jews who possessed horses and carts followed him, while those without means to provide for themselves remained behind, trusting in his protection. When the Duke was only 1 mile away, the enemies entered Konstantinov. It was Tuesday, the 9th day of the month of Av. 3,000 Jewish souls were mercilessly slaughtered, their possessions seized for plunder. Among the slain was the scholar, our teacher and master, Rabbi Asher, head of the rabbinical court and president of the Rabbinical Academy of the Holy Community of Polane, along with many other learned men whose names have been lost to memory. Following the looting of Konstantino, Duke Wisniowiecki sent word to the enemy, demanding, "How long will you continue to destroy cities and kill the innocent? If you are prepared for war and have a great army, let it be upon the battlefields." They chose for themselves a field near Lipowice on the river, 5 miles from Konstantino, and set their encampments there. On one side of the river stood the Cossacks and Tartars, on the other Duke Wisniowiecki and his troops. Reinforcements arrived on both sides. Khmel, the oppressor of the Jews, with all his Cossack troops and other Ukrainians, numbered approximately 600,000 men. Opposing them were about 80,000 Polish troops, led by General Duke Dominik and Duke Wisniowiecki. The Polish forces brought with them 150,000 wagons loaded with provisions, silver, gold vessels, garments, and an almost limitless quantity of royal treasures. Despite their numbers, the 600,000 Ukrainians were poorly matched against even 20,000 Polish troops. Many of them were simple villagers and townspeople, armed only with clubs and scythes, untrained in the art of war. Their strategy relied upon noise, frightful shouting, and cunning ambushes rather than skill in combat, except for a contingent of Cossacks and Tartars, numbering around 20,000. The Polish forces, in contrast, consisted of seasoned nobles and trained warriors. On Sunday, the 4th day of the month of Tishrei, the battle erupted. The Polish army prevailed, and Duke Wisniowiecki inflicted a terrible blow upon the enemy. On Monday, he grew stronger still, slaying thousands more of the Ukrainian forces. Had the nobles been allowed to strike again on Tuesday, none of the enemies of Israel would have remained. Their leaders would have been forced to surrender to their former Polish masters, to make peace and serve as in the days of old. When Schmiel learned of this, he devised a scheme. He sent letters to General Duke Dominic requesting a short respite on Tuesday, claiming the battle would resume on Wednesday. His true intent was to delay until Thursday, for two Tartar generals, Bey and Tuhai Bey, were approaching with 100,000 veteran Tartar soldiers, only a day's march away. Duke Dominic granted the request for respite. Yet even among the allies of Poland, questions arose. General Dominic and Vojevoda Tyszkiewicz, an appointed governor and commander of Lithuanian troops, spoke to Duke Wisniewski. How long will you continue to destroy the Ukrainians, who are our slaves? Who will plow the fields, tend our houses, and labor in our lands if they are slain? These words reflected a tension not only of war, but of fear, obligation, and the cruel calculations of those who relied upon the labor of those they considered subservient. The question of dominion weighed heavily upon the Polish troops as they watched the chaos unfold. Over whom will we then be the masters, they asked themselves, seeing the cruelty inflicted upon the Ukrainians and the Jews alike. And so, on that Tuesday, the Polish soldiers held back, showing compassion for the untrained villagers and townsfolk who had been swept into this war. They refrained from attacking the enemy, yet the enemy itself showed no mercy to those who fell into their hands. Toward the evening of that fateful Tuesday, 100,000 Tartar warriors arrived, riding into the Ukrainian camp like a storm of fire and steel. The Tartar warriors, skilled horsemen from the steppes of the east, brought with them timbrels, flutes, and trumpets, creating a clamor so loud that the earth itself seemed to quake beneath their celebration. The Polish forces could not understand the source of the enemy's rejoicing. In desperation, they captured a Ukrainian soldier and brought him before the dukes for questioning. The soldier explained, 100,000 Tartar soldiers have arrived to aid us. Their faces blaze with fire. Who among you can withstand them? Another version tells that Schmiel, the oppressor of the Jews, sent a missive to General Duke Ladislaw Dominik, the commander of the Polish army, with words both polite and threatening. Peace be unto you, our Lord, Duke Ladislaw Dominik, general of the Polish army. I and my people are grateful for the favor you granted us for the respite on Tuesday. But I warn you, a multitude of Tartars as the sands of the sea approaches. It is impossible to stand against them and my forces. Let not the kingdom of Poland fall into their hands. Because you have shown mercy to us, we shall reciprocate. We shall not destroy any cities under your rule as we have done elsewhere. When the dukes and nobles heard this message, terror gripped their hearts. In the middle of the night, all the dukes and nobles fled from their camp. By the break of dawn on Wednesday, the Polish soldiers, seeing their leaders had abandoned them, also fled. They left behind their tents, horses, asses, wagons, and carts, scattering silver, gold, clothing, and arms in their desperate haste. When the Tartars and Ukrainians finally reached the abandoned Polish camp, they could not believe their eyes. They suspected a trap, thinking the Poles might ambush them from the field, but scouts confirmed the camp was truly deserted. The road was littered with the remnants of flight, discarded clothing, wagons, and weapons, and the enemies spread out across the Kingdom of Poland, across Little Russia, and into the lands of Lithuania. At once, the Ukrainians rose against their former masters. They killed the nobles and Jews they encountered, with deaths of all manner of horror. For the Jewish people, this was a time of unprecedented distress, unlike any that had come before. Those who could flee sought refuge in fortified cities, the cities of Bar, Kamieniec-Podolski, Brody, Lwów, the capital of the region, Buchach, Jasłowice, Zolkiv, Narol, Przemysl, Belz, the monastery at Sokol, and Zamosk. Others fled to Wallachia, beyond the Carpathian Mountains, and still others crossed the Vistula River to escape. In the Kingdom of Lithuania, many sought safety in Wilno and Great Grodno, where the enemies did not appear. Yet in other communities where thousands of Jews had taken refuge, the enemy struck with terrible force. In the city of Homel, countless thousands were martyred for the sanctification of the name. The slaughter continued in Starodub, Chernigow, Brahin, and Lodawa, where approximately 10,000 souls perished by all manner of violent deaths. In remaining communities throughout Lithuania, Jews were killed in thousands and tens of thousands. May the Lord avenge their blood. Those in the cities of Sluk, Pinsk, and Brest-Litovsk tried to flee. Some escaped to Greater Poland, others by waterway to Danzig along the river Vistula. Yet many who remained in Brest-Litovsk